There have been many attempts to rate or rank the various post-war British Prime Ministers, but understandably so, they all come with their own inherent biases. So in order to combat this problem, I sought the infinite wisdom of our new collective overlords, artificial intelligence. Okay, so first up, we're going to be consulting Google's Bard. And after multiple warnings about the redundancy of numerical ratings, which is probably true, I've finally gotten it to rate every single post-war British Prime Minister. The first of which is Clement Attlee, who the AI gives 8 out of 10, citing post-war reconstruction, the establishment of the NHS, and granting independence to colonies, but does mark him down for failing to invest in emerging industries. Something that Bard actually doesn't mention is that under Attlee's leadership, the UK joined NATO, which undoubtedly played a part in the relative peace we've had since the Second World War. So overall, I think this is actually an appropriate rating. Just from an objective standpoint, standards of living did rise under Attlee, even if that was with a boatload of spending on the welfare state. Ultimately, regardless of your views on welfare, most historians tend to agree that it was what the UK needed after World War II. So again, I do think 8 out of 10 is a fair rating. Moving on to Winston Churchill, and it's important to note that this is only regarding his second term, as I think it's fair to say he would probably get some pretty high marks for his first. But for his second term, he gets an acceptable 6 out of 10. Bard calls him a wartime hero, which probably isn't relevant to a rating of his second term, but then cites his handling of the Suez Crisis. This refers to his reluctant agreement to withdraw British troops from Egypt after a revolutionary war. Though I'd argue this was not the worst the crisis would get, as we'll see with the next Prime Minister. But before that, I do think this rating of Churchill's second term is fairly appropriate. Something that Bard doesn't mention is that under Churchill, we did actually see the end of rationing, which was a major campaign promise leading up to the 51 election. Up next, as I alluded to before, Anthony Eden probably saw the worst of the Suez Canal crisis, which did ultimately lead to his resignation. And given his short premiership of just over a year, there really weren't too many redeeming qualities to his leadership, and therefore I'd probably say that Bard's rating of 4 out of 10 might just be a bit generous. Moving on to the second post-war Prime Minister to receive a fairly positive score, and that is Harold Macmillan. Bard credits him with economic success, which I'm actually hesitant to agree with, given that this was a period of stagflation. However, standards of living did rise, so I guess that's what they must be going off of. As for the negatives, Bard cites the many scandals and controversies that the Conservative Party was involved with under Harold Macmillan's leadership, showing that he probably didn't have too much of a grip on the party. This is backed up by the brutal cabinet reshuffle he performed, which was quickly dubbed the Night of the Long Knives. So even though these scandals did not involve Macmillan personally, and most would say that he actually had quite a positive character, his leadership was questionable at best. So I think this description that Bard gives doesn't exactly align with their rating of 7 out of 10. I would add in that he had kind of a mental relationship with John F. Kennedy, and this was really a golden era for US-UK relations. But objectively, I do think this score is a bit generous, and certainly doesn't reflect Bard's justifications. The next Prime Minister was Alec Douglas-Home, and if you're thinking, who on earth is that, I don't blame you, as he only served a year as Prime Minister after Macmillan's resignation, and was subsequently defeated by Labour leader Harold Wilson in the general election. So given his uninspiring and brief premiership, I think Bard's score of 4 out of 10 is fairly justified, though his calm and measured leadership was fairly uncontroversial. Up next is the aforementioned Labour leader Harold Wilson, who in a similar fashion to Winston Churchill served 2 separate terms, but for the sake of this list it appears that Bard has grouped them both into one. Giving him an acceptable rating of 6 out of 10, Bard cites his introduction of progressive reforms, many of which did pave the way for today's social climate, so in that sense they could definitely be described as quite forward-looking. However, Bard also cites his economic crises, the worst of which was probably devaluation, and also union unrest. This is of course referring to his failed in-place of strife legislation, which failed to stop the strikes that were causing an unbelievable amount of working days to be lost. It doesn't address it here, but I'd also like to mention his decision to stay out of the US's Vietnam War, which as we all know turned out to be a complete disaster. So in terms of social and foreign policy, Harold Wilson was fairly successful. But when it comes to the economy, which is probably the most important factor, his premiership was pretty dreadful. So I think 6 out of 10 is a little generous. Moving on to a similarly troubled Prime Minister, Edward Heath, who Bard also gives a similar rating of 5 out of 10. As a positive, it cites the UK's entrance into the European Economic Community, which would later become the European Union. And regardless of your stance on the organisation now, this was largely seen as a major achievement, especially considering that former Prime Ministers had tried did and failed to join the community. But then Bard also brings up the similar problems to Harold Wilson, such as the economy and strikes. Heath had his own failed piece of legislation called the Industrial Relations Act, and across his premiership, inflation remained above the target of 2%. So I think 5 out of 10 is a pretty fair score. Moving on to yet another Prime Minister marred by strikes, and that is James Callaghan, who gets a 4 out of 10. His premiership saw the worst of industrial action, with a certain period of time even being called the Winter of Discontent, where basically everyone was affected by strikes in some way or another. Callaghan also relied on a loan from the IMF, which definitely didn't signal confidence in the economy, so 4 out of 10 is probably spot on. Next up might just be the most controversial Prime Minister of all time, but Google's Bard actually seems to like her, giving her a relatively high score of 7 out of 10, citing her economic reforms and privatization which led to prosperity for some. This was the idea of people's capitalism that she tried to push. Bard also mentions her social divisions, which probably aren't as big as the economic divisions that occurred between the North and South after the closure of the coal mines. And finally, it also mentions the poll tax reform, which was what ultimately brought her down. I don't think this brief description is enough to cover her 11 years in power, and there are plenty of arguments on both sides as to whether or not she was a successful leader. But in terms of implementing her desired policy, she did do exactly that. So I think if it's possible to view it from an objective standpoint, I suppose this score is appropriate. Moving on to her less successful successor, John Major, who Bard gives a 5 out of 10, describing him positively as a competent administrator, as shown by his leadership in the Gulf War, but criticizes him for the Black Wednesday currency crisis and says that he lacked charisma. So I think this rating is probably appropriate, and the comment about his personality, while somewhat irrelevant, was definitely exacerbated by the next leader, Tony Blair, who gets an acceptable 6 out of 10. Bard praises his historic landslide victory and modernization through his reforms of the House of Lords and devolution, but then criticizes his handling of the Iraq War, where he was largely seen as beholden to US President George W. Bush, and then finally cites his erosion of civil liberties, culminating in his proposal to introduce ID cards. So I think on balance, 6 out of 10 is probably spot on. Up next is his successor Gordon Brown, who Bard gives a 5 out of 10, citing his management of the 2008 financial crisis, but also stating that he lost public trust during the recession. Both of these points sort of go hand in hand, as while we did escape from the 2008 financial crisis, there were definitely a few scars left behind. So 5 out of 10 is probably fair. Moving on to David Cameron, the first of the 5 consecutive Conservative Prime Ministers. Bard praises his coalition government with the Liberal Democrats, and even the controversial austerity measures. It also highlights his progressive social reforms, but says that these successes are overshadowed by the Brexit referendum. There was certainly a lot of misinformation leading up to the referendum, so much so that many argue that the public did not have a clear view of both sides of the issue, especially with the vast majority of MPs supporting the Remain campaign. So overall, I do think that 5 out of 10 is probably appropriate. Moving on to one of the lowest rated Prime Ministers on this list, Theresa May. Bard doesn't give any positives to her leadership and states that she was unable to secure a Brexit deal and lost Conservative Party unity. I think unity was probably off the table from the very start of the referendum, but she certainly didn't help. And Bard is right in saying that she failed to secure a Brexit deal, even calling an election in an attempt to increase her majority to pass her deal, which ultimately resulted in her losing her majority entirely. So I'd probably agree on the 3 out of 10 score. Next up is her Brexiteer successor Boris Johnson, who Bard gives a slightly less negative score of 4 out of 10, citing his success at negotiating a Brexit deal, but criticizing his handling of COVID-19 and the Partygate scandal. In fact, it wasn't Partygate that brought him down, but rather the appointment of Chris Pincher, but it certainly didn't help his public perception. Looking back on his handling of COVID-19, it was a pretty mixed bag. At first, his approval rating soared, with a unifying message that brought together the public. But then we sort of experienced this constant changing of guidance that ultimately resulted in a fairly confusing response, though the vaccine rollout was largely praised, so 4 out of 10 does seem fair. There's not much to say for his successor Liz Truss, who receives a measly 2 out of 10, which is actually higher than the amount of months she served in office. Yet during that time, she managed to crash the economy and divide the party. The only positives you could reasonably give her is the continued support of Ukraine and the beginning of relief towards energy bills, but overall I would still agree with Bard's score of 2 out of 10. And finally, while it was reluctant, I did push for a score on the current Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, which resulted in a range from 4 to 6. Bard praises his strides in pragmatism, EU relations, and restoring government credibility, but also criticizes his slow progress on the cost of living crisis, as well as internal party divisions as shown by his fallout with Suella Braverman. So as of right now, I do think my score would fall within that range. So what did we learn? Well, to put it simply, AI is not a big fan of the post-war British Prime prime ministers, giving them an average of just 5 points out of 10. But interestingly, when I asked the same question to ChatGPT, its scores for the post-war PMs leading up to Theresa May were almost an entire point higher. In fact, whenever there was a disparity between the two AI models, Google's Bard always gave the lower score. In terms of party performance, going back to the full up-to-date list, the Conservative Party averaged a score of 4.5 out of 10, while the Labour Party received a slightly better 5.7. But in fairness, it's a much smaller sample. If there's anything else you noticed, please feel free to point it out in the comments section down below. But if not, please still consider leaving a like and subscribing for more content like this every single week. Thank you for watching, see you next time.